Good morning. My name is Tim Kraus. Welcome to the First Unitarian Church of Cincinnati on this beautiful August Sunday morning. We're glad you're here. In this Unitarian Universalist community, we welcome all with love. We support learning and spiritual growth, serve our wider community, and work for justice, equity, and inclusion. Even though we're not together physically, we are going to have coffee hour today. After service, grab a cup of your favorite beverage and some snacks and come back to the computer for a virtual coffee hour. Coffee hour will be held in Zoom, so you will be able to see and talk with one another. And if you don't have the link, send an email to member-care@firstuu.com. That's member-care@firstuu.com, and someone will send you a link after the service. If you're new to First Church and want to know more about us, call or send an email. Our contact information is on our website at www.firstuu.com. That's www.firstuu.com. Include your name, address, and phone number so someone can get back with you. Now, before we light our chalice, I need to make mention that once again, gun violence has ripped through our community with 3 separate shootings overnight, leaving 2 dead and 17 injured. The insanity of this must stop, but right now, our prayers are focused on the suffering that this violence has created. Will you join me now in a moment of silence as we reach our hearts out to those who are in pain? Amen. Today, we light our chalice with the theme of imagination. For if we do not possess imagination, we cannot build a compelling vision for our future. The 2 ministers from our past that we are honoring today, James Handesid Perkins and William Henry Channing, were both imaginative and visionary leaders for our congregation. And we are all better for having had them in our presence in a very critical time in our church's history. Let us prepare our hearts for this service as the Cameron family brings our prelude, Imagine by John Lennon.
Nothing to kill or die for. Imagine no possessions. I wonder if you can. No need for greed or hunger. A community of us. Imagine all the people sharing all the world. You may say that I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us, and the world will live as one.
From Langston Hughes, Let America Be America Again. Let America be America again. Let it be the dream it used to be. Let it be the pioneer on the plain, seeking a home where he himself was free. The free? Who said the free? Not me. Surely not me. The millions on relief today? The millions shot down when we strike? The millions who have nothing for our pay? For all the dreams we've dreamed, and all the songs we've sung, and all the hopes we've held, and all the flags we've hung. The millions who have nothing for our pay except the dream that's almost dead today. Oh, let America be America again. Let the land that never has been yet, and yet must be, the land where everyone is free.
For our Story for All Ages today, Meredith has a very special presentation based on a poem that William Henry Channing wrote to Margaret Fuller, that great transcendentalist and Unitarian leader of ours, more than 160 years ago. It has been turned into a children's book by Mary Engelbreit, and it's called My Symphony. Some of the imagery that Mary Engelbreit used does not reflect gender stereotypes, that does reflect gender stereotypes that were common in that time period she produced this artwork. So we do ask your indulgence and also ask that you reflect more on the words of the poem than the imagery.
My Symphony by William Henry Channing, illustrated by Mary Engelbreit. To live content with small means, to seek elegance rather than luxury, and refinement rather than fashion. To be worthy, not respectable. And wealthy, not rich. To study hard, think quietly, talk gently, act frankly, listen to stars and birds, to babes and sages with open heart, to bear all cheerfully, do all bravely, await occasions, hurry never, to let the spiritual, unbidden, and unconscious grow up through the common. This is to be my symphony. My question for you.
I'm a nice guy. I learned that in college. A friend of mine was a biker, almost the same height, about 40 pounds more muscle. We met in Chem Lab at MIT. He asked if I would go on Thanksgiving vacation with him to visit his family. I looked forward to the visit. We drove from Cambridge to Baltimore in his pickup, his hog in the back. His family was nice. I was nice. It was a pleasant visit. After, my friend was glad I was with him. He wanted his family to meet some of his nice friends. I'm a nice guy. I got the creds. Today, Tim and I have worked up an anti-racism service, as he said. We talk about two of our ministers who worked together, William Henry Channing, and who was here in 1838 to 1841, and James Handyside Perkins, who arrived here in Cincinnati at the same time that Harriet Beecher Stowe did in 1832. What's that got to do with being nice or kindness? My wife, Jackie, keeps me up to date on women and poverty issues. She bought a new book, Hood Feminism, Notes from the Women That a Movement Forgot. The author is new to me, Mickey Kendall. Jackie read to me. Politeness, as filtered through fragility and supremacy, is not about manners. It's about methodology of controlling the conversation. Polite white people who respond to controls for respect, for getting boots off necks and demand for decorum, aren't interested in resisting disruption or resistance. They are interested in control. They replicate the manners of Jim Crow America, demanding deference and obedience. They want the polite facade, not disruption. I'm a nice guy. What does Kendall say about herself? She says, I'm a feminist, mostly. I'm an asshole, mostly. She's not a nice person. Imagine, do you think she's a biker? Imagine, how do you think of yourself? Are you nice? Are you kind? Tim and I started talking about this about a year ago, I reckon. I remember because at last October, Reverend Connie and I attended a UU history retreat in Baltimore. Reverend Connie is on the board of the UU History Society. The president of the Historical Society was promoting his new and latest book. Late that evening, I had a chance to sit down with John Burens. I told him we were planning a service which included some of the characters in his book. John's book, Conflagration, came out January. William Henry Channing is in there. Burens suggests that he wasn't quite up to the spiritual leadership and the preaching that was expected. Is that right, Tim?
Well, actually, I think the Reverend Dr. Burens has a little wrong, because this seems to me like 21st century revisionist history. The congregation at First Congregational Church of Cincinnati and William Henry Channing had a great loving relationship, and he was renowned for his oratorical skills.
Our two ministers in 1840, Channing and Perkins, were known as reformers. Reformers seeking utopia were springing up all over. Imagine a better world, a kinder world, a just world. That's why Perkins arrived here in Cincinnati in 1832. They were privileged. The Perkins of Boston, the Channings of Boston, what could be more privileged? Their privilege, well, Perkins practiced the path to a better world was through education. They were Boston Unitarians as well as just being educators. Their privilege, however, was built on the slave trade. Their families' fortunes came from the wealth of the world delivered to their wharfs. A friend of Henry Channing said it well. The abolitionist has shown us our dreadful debt to the Southern Negro. Channing's friend was Ralph Waldo Emerson. Emerson lectures on Man the Reformer, and it's about the dangers and risks, moral injuries, threatening a young person about to start out in life. The moral injuries Emerson illustrated came from climbing the career pole as a young person who was about to engage in the main industry of the day, the slave trade. Emerson commented, "How many articles of daily consumption are furnished us from the West Indies? The abolitionist has shown us our dreadful debt to the Southern Negro in the island of Cuba. In addition to the ordinary abominations of slavery, only men are brought to the plantations." And Emerson goes on, "If the accumulated wealth of past generations is thus tainted, we must begin to consider if it were not the nobler part to renounce it." Emerson calls for reparations. Really? Not again, not another time. Silence. I was struck how accurately Emerson tells us about James Perkins' career, the person who I'm going to speak more to today. Emerson discovered he had to fuel his own family by writing. Can you imagine becoming so famous, very famous as the bedrock of American truth, fundamental truth, as Cornel West tells us? Why does Ralph Waldo Emerson silence himself? My supposition is he did not want to see his family fall apart in poverty. He knew he was deep into the deep muddy of slavery, King Cotton's empire. Shh. Was Emerson just nice? Is that how we should understand his self-silencing? Let's take a larger view. Consider what was going on locally 100 years ago. Imagine. We need not imagine. Perkins says the year before he arrived here in Cincinnati, he worked on his family's trading ships, England, Caribbean. They stopped over in Barbados, the center of the English human trafficking industry. He was to learn the habits of commerce. What he learned was, regardless of morality, To make money, they would, as a regular rule, cheat in trade, avail themselves in the mischances of the poor, weave webs of speculation to control markets for their own gain by others' losses. No need to imagine, Perkins was filled at first with disgust, seeing the brutality, feeling the physical violence experienced as human trafficking. In despair, he could not make a living doing it. A better world always begin with imagination. Perkins would teach in classes for the intellectual education of women. Imagination is for things unseen, love, hope, things which are not before our eyes. Perkins said, our most moral bond of sympathy depends on a great measure upon our power of imagination. He could not ignore the booming human trafficking industry keeping the city's business going. It was an everyday occurrence to see a black man come from Kentucky, purchasing provisions for his master, and then in a few hours, on his way home and by himself, he would take the ferry back. Not so often he might see a black mother leading one child and carrying her infant. For too often he heard of black patrols with their braying hounds taking back a black youth across the river. Ohio's black laws, passed in 1804, blacks had to carry identification or were chased out. Ohio black laws were the toughest of any state along the Ohio River. Perkins took offense at these laws. They did all they could to prevent the education of blacks. Brought up as a Unitarian, Perkins knew better, and that the better world lay through the classroom, not in a rocking chair. He and his intimate friend Harriet Beecher Stowe agreed on education for all. Their mutual literary interests drew them closer together, seeing the brutality of their society. They did all they could to promote knowledge and awareness of the brutality, and then they were fascinated one day when there was a story of a young black mother, Eliza was her name, with her infant escaped over the breaking ice of the Ohio River just before Christmas in 1837. In 1841, a horrific event occurred. They said, just another race riot. Far worse. Blacks, whites set up barricades on the main streets of the Queen City, took out their guns, shooting at each other. The governor ordered troops in. In 1901, Carter Woodson launched his Journal of Black History with an account of Cincinnati's black community. Woodson quotes Perkins. These are Perkins' words from Woodson. There is no question, I presume, that the colored population of Cincinnati, oppressed as it has been by our state laws, as well as by prejudice, has risen more rapidly than almost any other people in any other part of the world. What does it mean? What does it mean to be nice? In 1840, Channing called a meeting in the church to invite Anti-Slavery Society. Perkins voted against it. Perkins wanted to end slavery. More important was educating blacks. As minister to the poor here in town, he sought he didn't want to offend anyone who gave him money to help support his efforts to feed the poor. Channing's crisis came when, during the excitements of the 1840 presidential election, when almost all his friends voted for the good General Harrison, he cast his votes for James Birney. Birney had been chased out of Cincinnati 4 years before that. His friends asked him what he was doing taking up with Birney. He was able to convince them that as his responsibility as a Christian was to say what he thought was true. Who attended this meeting? Only church members could vote. I think Alphonso Taft was there. 2 years later, he brought his bride, Fanny, back from Vermont. Friends of Perkins they joined. Alfonso identified as an Emerson Unitarian. His son was nicer. William Howard identified as a Channing Unitarian. And it was, I think, William Henry Channing, that Taft followed into the anti-slavery work. Why does Ralph Waldo Emerson silence himself? William Ellery Channing was Henry Channing's uncle and guardian. He was often nice enough against slavery, true, but he was always polite. Today, I believe a great shake-out is coming. It's happening. Is being nice enough? I think the more we can talk amongst ourselves, the better. This is not news for any of you, unless, of course, you think you will recover from COVID-19 by drinking Clorox. Are we just nice Americans? What about UU the Vote? That UU the Vote, if you're not familiar with, it was started about 2 years ago here in our denominational effort to get more people registered to vote. And our minister next week will be leading us in a discussion on what we will be doing as a congregation and her suggestions for us. I am a nice guy. John Lewis heard Dr. King's call for him to get into trouble. Good trouble. Is that nice? What do you realize when you have realized you have been silencing yourself? Ask, why? Why did I stay silent? James Perkins, our minister in the 1840s, was an intimate friend of Harriet Beecher Stowe. Stowe's image of the divine was the Virgin Mary. So this is for Harriet.
When I find myself in times of trouble, Mother Mary comes to me, speaking words of wisdom, let it be. And in my hour of darkness, she is standing right in front of me, speaking words of wisdom, let it be. Let it be, let it be, let it be, let it be. Whisper words of wisdom, let it be. And when the broken-hearted people living in the world agree, there will be an answer, let it be. For though they may be parted, there is still a chance that they will see. There will be an answer, let it be. Let it be, let it be, let it be, let it be.
In support of our congregation's work within and beyond these walls, the morning offering will be greatly received. There are many ways that you can support First Church. You can text the word GIVE to 513-717-7377. You can click Give Now on Breeze, our church management software system. You can donate online at www.firstuu.com. You can mail a check to First Unitarian Church of Cincinnati at 536 Linton Street, Cincinnati, Ohio, 45219. And remember, if this is your first time visiting, please let the virtual plate pass you by. We are grateful for your presence. Forgive me for my casual attire, for I was told by one of your members that it's common and sometimes even expected for modern-day Unitarian Universalists to sort of dress down for the Sunday morning service. And he was kind enough to loan me this shirt so I can feel more at home with all of you. And even though I can't see anyone in the sanctuary, I'm only talking to this camera on something you call streaming YouTube? Kind of strange for a man from the 19th century to understand, but I'm going to try to go with the flow. And you know, it seems like it's rather odd for such an esteemed group of people as yourself to sort of dress casually for church, because in my day and age, church was something that was very, very important, and you wore your very best clothing for that. But I get ahead of myself. Let me introduce me. I am William Henry Channing, and I served this congregation from the years 1838 to 1841. I know it was a short time, but it was really a significant time in my life, and it actually changed my life, and I think that I had an impact on your congregation. I first arrived in 1838, and it was for a 6-month trial. So my wife and daughter, they stayed back in Boston while I just really honed in and worked hard on convincing this congregation that I should be their minister. And, you know, when I arrived, your church was actually quite young. It was only 8 years old, and you'd had a succession of short-term ministries and pulpit supply, might I add, most all of them from Boston. And I was one more Boston figure to come in and try to woo this congregation and to get you to accept me. Well, I think I was successful because in March of 1839, there was a unanimous vote to call me to the ministry here at the First Congregational Church of Cincinnati. And so I immediately began to immerse myself in the life of Cincinnati. One of the first things I did was I joined a literary club called the Semicolon Club. Now that Semicolon Club, they met across the street from our church, and it was founded by Dr. Daniel Drake, and I think today that Dr. Drake actually has a hospital named after him somewhere here in Cincinnati. But anyway, Dr. Drake started this literary society, and some of the membership were the most important liberal folks of the city. I know that the former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Salmon P. Chase, was a member of that club. So was Harriet Beecher Stowe, Calvin Stowe, some of the Lane Seminary students, and many other people here in Cincinnati who were interested in becoming writers or were seeking the support of other writers to read their work. And so we all took turns sharing our writing with each other. And it was wonderful for me because I developed a fairly close relationship with both the Beecher and the Stowe families and all of the students at Lane Theological Seminary. But a little bit more about that later. Essentially, I had to align myself with the liberal community in Cincinnati. But true to tradition, Cincinnati was not a bastion of liberalism. Even though I hear that your city voted for Obama in 2012 and 2008 and possibly for Clinton in 2016, it's still not really considered a liberal town. This is a conservative town. And when I arrived there was a lot of tension, just like there is today. This is a dynamic city of extremes, and it was no more extreme than what we experienced in the 1830s. This was a town that was doubling in size every 10 years. That alone would be enough to create chaos in any kind of city because the infrastructure of the city couldn't ever keep up with the population growth. And so one of the consequences of that was that disease ran rampant. If you think you're fighting a difficult battle today with all of the pandemic that you are facing, back then we had thousands of people die at one time from cholera or typhoid fever. And I know my dear friend Harriet even lost a son to cholera in 1849. That was a big blow to her, and it really changed her attitude toward life and also put her in closer touch with people who experienced the pain of slavery and having their children sold from them. So I get here to this city, and I also realize that not only is it a boom town, but it's a town that is dependent on the institutions of slavery. It's dependent economically on the slave South, and yet it has one of the most diverse populations of black and white of any city in America. There was actually in 1829, I was told, we had the largest population of African Americans, or blacks at that point, of any city in America. 10% of the population of Cincinnati was free black. Now, that caused a lot of concern among the business community because here they were making a lot of money off of slavery, and they were dealing exclusively by providing supplies of meat products, finished goods, all kinds of things. We built cotton gins, we built the sugar refineries, so there was a lot of money to be made off of slavery. That didn't sit well with the business community nor the owners of the slaveocracy in the South who had to do business here when they would see that 10% of the population was free black. So they started putting pressure on the business community of Cincinnati. And the business community of Cincinnati responded in kind, and they urged the lower working classes of Cincinnati to stage riots to drive the black population out of this city. So in 1829, 10% of the population was black, and in 1830, after the 1829 riots, only 5% of the population was black. People who were leaving the city either in a pine box or they were escaping north to freedom in towns like Yellow Springs or going all the way on up to Canada. So this was the kind of dynamic that was going on in the city. And not only that, but we had great divisions of class. Now, the people of our congregation obviously were coming from a much more of an upper class position than the rest of the city. But you had an upper class community primarily confined in the religious and business community of the city, but then you also had a working class that was divided between the races, a black working class and a white working by the businesses. So in some senses, the chattel and industrial slavery that existed here in this city, because people were paid a pittance for the work that they did, and they worked in those meatpacking plants, and they worked in those sugar mill manufacturing plants. They built steamboats, they unloaded steamboats. It was a very terrible place for many people to live. But fortunately, and maybe unfortunately for our congregation, we had little identification with those folks. Now, one of the things that I have to keep reminding myself is that I'm an extemporaneous speaker, and I was very well known for going and delivering my sermons without any notes at all. But today, I do have notes because I want to confine myself, because you never want to let an extemporaneous preacher from the 19th century have the pulpit unless you're ready to be there for another hour and a half once he starts. So I'm going to use this script to help limit me in what I'm talking about. So now, the irony of my ministry in this church was the fact that I was hired in part because I was an eloquent speaker and that I was a passionate advocate of anti-slavery politics in America. And I could preach eloquently against the immorality of slavery, and the congregation wanted to hear that kind of thing, because I sensed that the majority of the members of our congregation did recognize how immoral this institution of slavery was. And it was one of those things that really led to conflict for all of us down the road. So, and I spoke about slavery frequently to much acclaim. They loved my oratory, but as sure as I'm standing here, they did not want anybody from our church to do anything about slavery. And that's one of the great contradictions that we all faced here. And I think that this was something that every Unitarian church in America had to face, that contradiction, because slavery was the dividing issue that was sorting out who you were and where you were in America all this time period before the Civil War. It was also the dividing point of determining what kind of a democracy was this young America going to have when it was all said and done. It actually took a second American Revolution, the Civil War, for us to actually define the fact that all people were created equal. So, in 1840, as Frank had alluded to, the Anti-Slavery Society approached me, and they said, "You're a liberal congregation in the middle of a very conservative city, and you're right downtown. That's a wonderful setting for us to be able to hold our anti-slavery meetings, because we need to attract people from the downtown area. We can't just be out in the suburbs or in the countryside out here in Walnut Hills where Lane Seminary was." And so I took the proposal to the church, and the church, following their congregational polity, decided to have a vote on this. And they voted overwhelmingly against having this anti-slavery meeting held in our church on a regular basis. Now, I was one of the few, because I was a pew holder as well, I was one of the few that decided that this was something that we needed to do because it was a growth opportunity for our church. But not to be. And as Frank indicated, even my dear beloved cousin James Perkins decided that he did not want to have that anti-slavery meeting in our church as well. Now, in hindsight, I have to look at why that happened. That happened because there were some prominent business people in our congregation who made a tremendous amount of money off of the proceeds of slavery. So they understood the morality of it, but they just didn't see any way out of it, because this was their livelihood. This was their way of making money. So the conflict of interest was obviously just too great. But for the rest of the congregation, I think they were just plain afraid. And they saw that the radical abolitionists were just a step too far for them to embrace. And they witnessed the Lane Seminary rebellion in 1834 and 1835, and they saw what happened. They saw this rebellion take place. They saw and witnessed the Lane students coming down in large numbers down to the downtown area of Cincinnati so that they could live in the community with the black population. They were helping to set up makeshift schools. They were working on mutual aid societies, and they were generally fraternizing with the black population. This was an outrage to the respectable people of Cincinnati. And it was just too far, because even though people recognized slavery as an immoral thing, they did not actually see people of color being equal to Europeans. And that was the bottom line. And there was a social taboo against interacting and fraternizing too closely with the black population. In fact, it was actually even written into the black codes that Frank alluded to. So the Lane Seminary students, they even challenged those understandings and that orthodox way of handling things by holding an interracial picnic on the grounds of the seminary in 1835, and that was scandalous to the city of Cincinnati. And I'm sure it was scandalous to some of the members of First Unitarian Church. But at any rate, whenever the Lane students were walking downtown in the company of a black resident of the city, the white population of Cincinnati would spit on them. They would assault them. They would tell them to get out of the community and stop messing with the race relations of the city, and that they were disturbing the peace of this fair city. And so when our respectable people in our congregation saw the position that the radical abolitionists were taking and how they were alienating the rest of the white population, it was just a bit too far for them to travel. And, respectability was one of the assets of the Unitarians nationwide, but it was also one of the afflictions of Unitarianism, and it still is an affliction today. Respectability is something that often gets in the way of us doing what is right. So my word to you from the 1840s is take heed. We have been here before. We do not need to be on the wrong side of history again. Because I suspect that we're facing, Unitarians nationwide and Universalists are facing a similar problem today with their inability to totally embrace the movement for black lives and the modern day abolitionists who would love to see the abolition or the abolishing of predatory police departments and the abolishing of a prison industrial complex that is reviving the institutions of slavery today. That, for many Unitarians, is just a bridge too far once again. But we must be careful about what we're doing, and my experience from the 1840s speaks loudly to that. We do not need to be on the wrong side of history. Now, one of the surprising things about my relationship with this congregation was that they had no problems with my public advocacy of Christian socialism. Now, I realize socialism in the 21st century is an epithet, and it's been distorted out of its reality. But back in the 19th century, many people accepted the idea that socialism was a legitimate political position to take. And basically, what we define socialism is as to live in community with mutual support, recognizing that all people are better off when we work together for the common good. It is not the hyper-individualism of American capitalism. It is the fact that we are in community with each other and supporting each other that is really important. And so I believe your first principle and your seventh principle both encompass those interests that I had in socialism, because calls for respect and dignity for all and a recognition of their interdependent existence of all life. We need to support each other. But for me, it was just a simple thing that I wanted to follow the teachings of Jesus Christ. All God's children are equal, and they deserve to live lives of dignity and purpose regardless of the conditions of their birth. Some of my most eloquent sermons were on this notion of Christian socialism and comparing the teachings of Jesus with the tenets of socialism. And I did this publicly, and I also did it from the pulpit in our church. So I think the message got through in some respects because it was received fairly well in our congregation, because our congregation even allowed the socialist utopian communities that were forming in Ohio to meet in our church. And in fact, that's how the young Peter Clark got his first introduction to socialism, in the basement of our church with his family as they were meeting with the planners of the utopian communities. And in fact, his uncle joined the community of Utopia about 45 miles east of the city. So it was an interesting contradiction here, because we had a struggle with the issue of slavery, but we could support the ideas of socialism even when the core message of that movement ran counter to the class privilege that all of us in the congregation enjoyed, myself included. We all live with contradictions, don't we? Well, my tenure in the pulpit in Cincinnati was short-lived because I had a crisis of faith. I started to recognize that many of the trappings of Orthodox Christianity were no longer something that I believed in. My faith in God never changed, nor my faith in the teachings of Jesus, and I also embraced the idea of a universal immortality. I didn't believe in hell, just like the Universalists didn't, because I recognized that hell on earth was the slavery that we were witnessing in our own country. So I could no longer believe in the unnecessary baggage of Christianity, however. I couldn't buy the virgin birth, the miracles of Jesus, Jesus being the Son of God, and the need to say the right words in the right order, and the Calvinist claptrap of predestination. Now, there were many in our congregation that didn't have any problem with any of that, even the predestination part, because as Unitarians and people of privilege, they were sure they were going to go to heaven anyway, even if Calvin was right about predestination. So what was their concern? So regardless of how much we loved each other in this congregation, I no longer felt that I could, in good conscience, be your minister, because my theology was changing, and I knew that I wouldn't last long if my theology was at great variance with the members of my congregation. And so I decided that I had to move on, and I wrote one of the most painful resignation letters of my life. And I recognized the wisdom of that when I saw what happened to my colleague Moncure Conway when he came here and had the same theological problems with our congregation. Combined with the issues of slavery, where he was probably much, much more militant about abolitionism than I was, the theology was also a stumbling block, and it ultimately created a schism and a division in our church and the forming of two separate congregations. We even lost Horace Mann, who was a member of our congregation, and while he was president of Antioch College, he joined the Church of the Redeemer instead of staying on with Alphonso Taft and the rest of the Unitarians. So I left because I did not want to fall prey to the siren of comfort, and I did not want the complacency that would come with that, because I knew that I had to do something different with my life. So I left this congregation, but I continued on in the ministry, and I served in Rochester, New York, where I worked with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass when they were all working together for women's rights and racial equality. I lament the fact that Susan and Elizabeth rejected the idea of racial equality after the Civil War, but before that, they were really working in unison with each other. I then took a church in Liverpool, England, and then I came back to the United States in the middle of the Civil War to serve as the Unitarian minister in the Church of Washington, D.C. I then became the chaplain of the House of Representatives and a confidant to the President of the United States. That access to the President helped my dear friend Moncure Conway when he was helping to spirit away the people his family had enslaved on their plantation in Virginia, and they ultimately made their way to Yellow Springs. So he was able to get access to Lincoln because I had that access. So, in conclusion, what I want to say to you is that this is a loving congregation. We had a wonderful time with each other, even amidst all of the conflicts, because I know that the people of this church truly wanted to be, they wanted to live with a clear conscience. So one piece of advice that I have for you is that I know that you've got a lot of work laid out for you as you move toward becoming a more inclusive community. But in so doing, please do not take yourself so seriously that you miss the beautiful people that you are. We're all flawed, and you will all make a large and small mistakes along the way. However, you're only going to get there if you lead with forgiving kindness and love for each other. And that really is the message and the bond that we have always had as a congregation here in Cincinnati. Will somebody say amen? Will you please join me as we extinguish the chalice by reading these words on your screen together? We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
From John Lewis. Never become bitter. Never become hostile. Never hate. Live in peace. We're one people, and one love. Amen.